Hello, everybody. This is Rodney Kelm, the Fatherpreneur. And after a short Thanksgiving break, I am back with purpose-driven content. And I'm so honored to have tonight's guest on. We're just talking together about our kindred spirit for fatherhood. And he is somebody who's waving the flag for fatherhood tirelessly. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome tonight's guest, Mr. Devon Bandison. Welcome, Devon.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rodney. I appreciate being on the show and also love all the work you're doing.
Yeah. And of course, if you haven't heard already, he's got the New York accent. So which borough are you from, son?
Well, I'm representing what we call the Q borough of Queens. So born and raised in Queens, New York. But, you know, we have love all throughout the boroughs out here in New York City, especially this time of year around the holidays. A lot of love out here in New York.
My number one favorite rapper of all time happens to be from Queensbridge by the name of Nas.
Well, we are a kindred spirit because that is also my favorite rapper of all times. And it's hard to pass it on to generation. But even my 18-year-old daughter, who didn't grow up with Nas, she's taking Nas as her favorite as well. So
he's just classic music. And, I'm from California, so it's a little bit sacrilegious to put him in number one. But for me, dude is number one. So I'm glad we got the same number one and probably in our top five. But to get the conversation going, I just want you, we obviously know you're from New York, but just tell us about, your childhood, how things began, your family life, your younger years. How did that all start out?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in New York, and father and mother got divorced at an early age. And both my father and mother were big into basketball at an early age. My father started one of the biggest basketball programs in New York City. So at an early age, I was around a lot of NBA stars, future NBA stars, Mark Jackson, Kenny Anderson, and I really started playing ball. And then high school, I became pretty well-known basketball player, played all throughout New York City, throughout the country. My father suffered through drug addiction in my teenage years, and it really had an effect on me. And I was one of those guys whose father became absent during their young years and their adolescent years. And I think many men go one or two ways. They either kind of have a bad template and they start repeating the same mistakes as their father, or they make what I call the promise. And that's what I did. I made the promise. And the promise, Rodney, is something that goes like this. When people have a difficult, maybe upbringing or a father who's absent, they make a promise that when they become a father, they're not going to try to make the same mistakes. And so, I played basketball in college. And when I got out, I dedicated my early career to developing programs for at-risk youth in New York City, and really did a lot of that. I ran a lot of tournaments in New York that really involved the community. And eventually I was put in charge of it in a non-for-profit to start developing fatherhood programs. So in New York City, I developed first-time fatherhood programs for this nonprofit for a number of years. Fatherhood is near and dear to my heart. I'm a father of 3 beautiful and wonderful children. And then a few years back, I was speaking a lot, and I was asked to speak on leadership and fatherhood and conferences. I did a lot of workshops and seminars, and I launched my business a few years back around coaching and speaking. And it's been an amazing journey since. I have clients, started out with coaching strictly fathers on leadership and how fatherhood is leadership and developing to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And then my coaching practice has grown to really, now I'm coaching a lot of professionals, both men and women. So that's it in a nutshell.
So I wanted you to take us back into a very important part of your story, because there's probably a young man out there that's going through what you went through, where your father was taken away from you, or at least, time by drugs. And I can relate. My mother was a recovering addict from when I was about 8, 7 on through the rest of my life. But what was your father's drug of choice, and had it been something that he was recreationally using, or did it just sort of come into his life later?
Yeah, so my father was pretty inconsistent early on, didn't know what that was. I remember when I was 9 years old, my mom and dad had divorced, and I had asked my mom, what's up with dad, and she had actually driven me to this place all the way out in Long Island. I thought we were going to a jail or something, and it was a treatment facility, which I didn't know at the time what it was. I kind of, you know, at 9 figured that out. But I was just glad he was doing, like, he seemed like he was doing okay. He didn't look like himself, but it seemed like he was getting some help. So, you know, it was a struggle through your teenage years. You're trying, you know, for young men especially, you're trying to find out who you are, and you're trying to get your own identity. And for me, it was kind of constantly looking for that validation somewhere. And oftentimes, young men struggle with this. So by the time, you know, I was about 13, 14, he had, you know, really suffered into addiction pretty deep, using crack. I remember coming home and our basement had been turned to a crack den. And for me, I at that point, it was for some reason, and young people can maybe relate to this, I started blaming myself at one point and said, you know, how could he choose this substance over me? And there was a lot of, and I think this is the thing, what I love working with men and fathers, because young boys at an early age are taught misinformation. We're taught that we shouldn't show our emotions. We should never let people see when you're hurting. You should never show people you're vulnerable, because where I came up, if you showed you were vulnerable, people would take advantage of you. But what happens is when a young man is teenage years and he's basically suffering in silence, you know, there's no real healing in that process. And only till I got my children and I was able to speak about my story did the healing really begin. So that's kind of what has driven my purpose and my passion for this work for men, not only mentoring young men, but also coaching fathers in how to tell their story, and understanding that vulnerability is actually one of the most courageous things you can show.
You did something that I can relate to that I did when I was about almost 5, where you said you made your decision. Can you take us to that moment in time? Did you make a audible proclamation, or was it something internal that you said, when I grow up, I'm going to be better, I'm going to be different?
Mm-hmm. It was an internal, but it was not a one-time thing. It was a internal affirmation to myself that when I get a chance to give back and to have my own children, I wanted to show up more powerfully. And part of my healing process, Rodney, is, you know, my father got clean years after, but I still had these unresolved issues. And what I've realized was when I started, you know, I was a good father. I was showing up for my children. But, you know, I didn't have a template on how to be a good father. So I wasn't as consistent in my 20s as I am now. I didn't understand the value of being present more often at that age, because I really had no template of how to do this thing. I just knew that I had to be present more than my father, and I kind of learned as I went along. But, you know, what I realized later on was that when I started healing my relationship with my father, actually all my relationships in my life got better. I became a better son. I became a better father. I became a better brother. I became a better just friend, because something about, you know, holding on to unresolved resentments, and how I got to that point with my father, Rodney, was, you know what? I realized that he was just doing the best he could with the hand he was dealt. He was misinformed at an early age, and he made some decisions based on that misinformation. And I'm not in a point to be in judgment. And I realized he was just doing the best he could with the information he had.
Well, we definitely can relate on that point as well, especially on basketball. You know, I may not look like it, but I'm 6'7" when I stand up. So I played a little bit of basketball, right? So,
Okay.
you know, I can relate to, you know, basketball taking you through high school and college and really getting you through those years. Do you think that basketball was an outlet, a safety zone? What was basketball to you in your life?
Great question, Rodney. I mean, it was absolutely an outlet for me. It was, you know, we grew up in an era where we'd go to the park early in the morning and we played till it was nightfall. And it was my way to get that anger, that frustration, that lack of validation, that feeling unwanted, feeling out on the basketball court. And it's good when you have a purpose and you're focused on something, and you're also around a community of other young men who are staying out of trouble and just trying to, we were all trying to make the NBA back then. So it was nice. And I still run into people today. I have them on my podcast. They have successful lives. Some are coaches. Some are doing some great stuff in business. And it's a community of people that I still run into to this day. So it's pretty cool. My son's 14. He just made his high school team. He's a pretty good player. And he thinks it's pretty cool when I go out with him. And there's some old heads, as we call it in the basketball world, that I still run into.
Yeah, I know that term. I'm officially an old head. Whenever I step into any kind of school, classroom, or gym, I'm somebody's dad right away. I'm not. They know I'm not to be, playing on the JV team. It's obvious nowadays. So,
right.
You bringing up some good men, especially called old heads. And I heard that term for the first time in 1999. I'm like, what's an old head? Now I know. I am an old head.
That's right.
So we're resigned to Monday night pickup ball or Saturday morning, right?
Yep, that's it, man.
Yeah. So you can get that itch, you got to play. But just getting back to your story, so you finished college, and how did you just sort of? I mean, you've already been fueled by your desire to be a better father, when you grew up. But how did you fall into the work that I remember reading a part of your story. Working with young men when you first got out of college, and something really struck me. But I want you to tell the viewers, how did you just sort of, get in line with this sort of career path, and then fall into what you fell into? Or did you create something when you graduated college?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it was interesting. I mean, I can't say I had like the foresight that, how my career would end up, how it is today. To me, it was a natural progression to get into work in the community, because even through my high school years, what we used to do when you were a pretty good ball player, you used to go and you were counselors at camps. And I really liked coaching and giving back to young people and mentoring kids who were coming up under me. And I was the guy who every summer, when you're on basketball scholarship, they would give you a lot of gear. And I was the guy who used to come back from North Carolina from school and like give out a lot of my gear in the neighborhoods. And I used to run community tournaments in the neighborhoods. And my community tournaments were a little different, because I would have the grandparents in the neighborhood cooking food for the tournament. I would have the teenage kids as the DJs for the tournament. And I had the young kids like selling water. So I was always like community oriented. I always knew that like at some point my success would be measured in not how much I got, but how much I served and gave back. And that's what kind of got me into this field. And my first job was really in this nonprofit agency for children who had struggled in neighborhoods like I knew and grew up in. And I really wanted to be of service. I didn't know where that would take me. It was just part of my journey, and it really prepared me for the work I'm doing today.
I want you to tell the audience a little bit about the story that I read when I first learned about you online. Is where there was one young man that you really connected with. And I remember you describing that you didn't really feel either equipped or ready, but you ended up having a great impact on his life. Tell us about that story in your words.
Yeah, so my first job out of college in this at-risk program, we were working with young people who were struggling with behavioral and mental health issues. And my first person I was going to work with was this young man who I called Sean. And I remember reading Sean's chart, and Sean had been hospitalized about 7 times in the prior year for serious behavioral issues. He had jumped from foster care home to foster care home, had no father, and he was just being reunited with his mother. And coincidentally, like a month earlier, our first daughter was born. So I was a first-time father, and I was new in this field. And I remember after reading this chart, I go to Brooklyn, New York. Right before I hit Sean's doorstep, I became a little overwhelmed. I felt like I didn't have the skill set. I felt like I didn't have what it takes to make an impact on this young man's life. I didn't know what I was going to do. And it was a similar feeling that I felt a month earlier when our daughter was born. Although I was excited to be a first-time father, I didn't feel like I was prepared. This is a new life that I'm responsible for. It was a similar feeling. So I went into Sean's home, and we started talking and engaged with him. And eventually I asked him this simple question that I think changed everything. Instead of going in there and having a plan and telling them what I wanted to do, I think my being naive and my first work experience helped me in this situation because I just listened. And at some point I asked Sean, I said, Sean, what do you want out of your life? You know, he was 14 at the time. I said, what would be success for you if we look down the road? And he looked at me, he hesitated, and he said, you know, Mr. B, nobody's ever asked me that. Nobody's ever taken the time to ask me what I wanted. And he went on to tell me, Rodney, that he wanted to be the first in his family to graduate college, and he was interested in a music career. So we started working together, and I told Sean I had no expectations, but if he wanted to do an agreement, this would be the agreement. And the agreement was if he did what he had to do, if he showed up for school, if he was willing to be open-minded to kind of the stuff we would work together on, I would hook him up with a friend of mine who was running a music program in New York City. And he did what he had to do, and I hooked him up with this, my friend of mine in New York City with the music program, and kind of my work with Sean had ended. And at five years later, I was walking downtown Brooklyn, New York, and I heard this young man screaming down the block. He was like, Mr. B, Mr. B. And I turned around, and it was Sean. And he was 19 at the time. He looked amazing. So we had some time to sit down, and I asked him how he was doing, and he said he's doing wonderful. He told me he had just finished his first year of college, and he had just signed with a major record label, and one that everybody heard of at the time. And I was overwhelmed, Rodney. I had goosebumps. I really, you know, it almost brought me to tears. And I asked him, I said, you know, Sean, what was the turning point? You had a pretty rough upbringing, and you know, what was the turning point? He said, you know, Mr. B, when you came to my house 5 years ago, it was the first time someone gave me hope when I felt hopeless. He said, when you came to my house, it was the first time someone gave me a choice when I didn't think I had choices. And lastly, he said, you know, when you came to my house, it was the first time someone gave me a voice when I felt like I had no voice. And he turned to me and said, you know, you're like the father I never had. And I only spent a little time with this young man, but I was invested in seeing him do better. And it was one of those impactful, life-changing stories. And when I looked at him, I wondered, what did I really give him? And that's when I started this movement of fatherhood and leadership, because obviously I wasn't his biological father, but in some way I influenced him in such an impactful way, according to him, that I think that's the highest form of being a leader, and leadership is not by your title, not by your position, but how your actions can influence another life. And that really was one of the milestones that turned me even more passionate into this fatherhood and leadership community that I developed.
That story is the one that definitely just said, you know what, I'm supporting this guy. Because I think as men, we can all relate, especially if you have children, we can all relate to what you just described about not feeling equipped, you know, learning as you go. And I can completely relate. And, you know, following your progression online and the things that you do, I know that you actually had a great honor of speaking at a TED Talk. Well, I want you to tell my audience that aspires to speak, that aspires to do things that get you at a level that gets you a lot of attention on your cause. What were the things that you think that you did that qualified you to speak in such a platform as a TED Talk?
Mm-hmm. You know, the first thing that, you know, I tell people is that if you follow, for me, it was, what do I know and what I'm passionate about? And the number one thing that I think helped me get to that position where I was asked to do a TED Talk was I was putting a lot of work in, Rodney, just serving people. I really cared about the fatherhood community. I was putting a lot of content out there. I was sitting down in coffee shops, talking to fathers. I was developing programs. And when you go out and you serve people, as opposed to looking for something or getting something from people, it just naturally, I think, puts you in a better position of abundance. So just by me serving people, I think people had a great response to the things I was doing, to the programs I had online to how I was coaching people. And I think that's what built up an audience and a community that wanted to follow me and wanted to know what I was doing. And I think because of that, somehow the word spread and it got to the TED organizers, and they gave me a call and asked me if I wanted to go down to Florida and be part of their event. And it was a big honor. As someone who has spoken for a while, I think that anybody who goes on the TED stage it's an honor. It's one of those milestones in life that you really have on your bucket list. And if someone's out there and they want to be a speaker and they want to be on a stage for whatever their cause, what I would say is just continue to work and get out there and speak as much as you can. When I started, I was speaking for free before I ever got paid to speak. I had joined Toastmasters at a job when I was working for someone. I put in the dues, and if someone has an aspiration to speak on a stage like TED or any other stage, I would say speak as much as you can. Go out there, volunteer, and eventually, there's an old saying that if you do more than you're paid, if you do more than you're paid to do, one day you'll be paid for something like that. So anyway, put in the work, and I think that good content and serving people puts you in a position where people want to know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you definitely, encouraged and motivated me with our stories being so similar. Now that you're a father of 3, and you said that you began to mend your relationship with your father, how is your relationship with him now, and then his relationship with your children, his grandchildren?
Yeah, so his relationship with my children is great, and he's clean about 15 years now, and him and I over the last few years, it's been a process, right? It's been a real communication was key to the healing. I felt like I had to sit down man to man, and sometimes when you speak to older generation or they speak to a younger generation, there's this misconception that sometimes people are stuck in their ways, which they are. But on the other hand, that doesn't, what can change that is communication. So I asked him if he'd be willing, and we spent some time together to kind of work through some of the stuff. And I was able to let him know how I felt. He kind of let me know how he felt. And I felt, it was a work in progress. Last week, him and I got an annual football game. He's a Jet fan. I'm a Dolphin fan. So we go to the annual football game every year. This was the first year in 4 years that we lost. So he had a great time rubbing it in on the way home. But the relationship, it's work. I'm not going to say that you just get up and the pain from your childhood just disappears. But I'm also a big believer, and I teach people this, that in life, you have 2 options. You either want to be the owner of your experience, you want to be the owner of your happiness, or you can be a victim of your circumstances. And I chose to take ownership of my life and my happiness and my relationship with my father. And I realized that for that relationship to be better, I couldn't focus on him. I had to focus on me showing up as the best version of myself that I can be. And I think that translates in any relationship, whether it's mending a relationship with your father, whether it's your spouse, whether it's a family member, or whether it's with your children, that if you take the focus off them and focus on what you can do to show up, I think that goes a long way.
As we go ahead and begin to round out this conversation, knowing that you coach, knowing that you mentor, if there was one message that you would definitely want the audience to know, any man, woman watching, what would that signature message be so that they can hear it from you?
Well, I mean, the message that I send out to the fathers out there is that for me, fatherhood is leadership, and leadership is not about your title or your position. It's about how you show up on a daily basis and how your actions really impact the lives of your children, your family, and your loved ones. And on a general, to the men and women out there, I think that be of service. If you come from a place of service and understanding that service starts with you, if you don't take care of yourself, it's like the airplane mask analogy, oxygen mask on the plane. When the plane's going down and the oxygen mask comes out, they say, please put anyone who's with you. And I think that so many times people want to help and be this great server, but they forget that service starts with themselves. So please take the time. I encourage people, the best investment you'll ever make is an investment in yourself and becoming the best version of yourself you can be, because once you do that, Rodney, you make everything around you better.
You know, for most of my interviews, I have to pull things out of people. But you know, the way that you've already told your story, the way that you delivered your points, you just blew it up. So, you know, I want to just round things down and end this conversation tonight for the audience out there by saying, thank you for your most valuable commodity on earth, which is your time, because once you give it away, you'll never get it back. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Purpose-Driven Content on fatherpreneurship.com. Make sure you like, comment, and share. If you want to connect with Devon, give out your website real quick.
Yeah, you can see me, find me at devonbandison.com, and I'm all over Twitter at Devon Bandison. Love to connect with you guys. I'm pretty active on social media.
Let me see. I'm trying to type it up right now. Is that the correct website right there?
That's it. You're quick, man.
Make sure you get on. You know, he delivers great content. I truly enjoy his content. I share it all the time because I know it's very valuable. So I want to thank everybody, my audience for tonight, all the people who helped me syndicate this content. Thank you. You know, if you've gotten value from this, make sure you tune into other episodes. Check out other interviews on fatherpreneurship.com, and make sure you share it with somebody who needs to hear words of encouragement, motivation, and inspiration. God bless you, and see you next time.
Thanks,